Hello and welcome to WION Live Broadcast from London. I'm Ollie Barrett and these are the top stories this hour. The COVID-19 pandemic dampens New Year's Eve celebrations for a second consecutive year as multiple countries imposed restrictions, and the World Health Organization warns a tsunami of infections threatens to overwhelm healthcare systems. Ahead of a telephone call between Vladimir Putin and Joe Biden, the Kremlin says it wants to resolve tensions with the US through talks. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi warns the US of an unbearable price over its actions and speaking about Taiwan. Two people are charged with sedition after the raid on the Hong Kong news outlet Stand News on Wednesday. The United States condemns the closure of the outlet and says it undermines the reputation of the Chinese-ruled financial hub. A huge fire at Australia's old Parliament House in Canberra. And India become just the third team to beat South Africa at their Centurion Fortress. The Proteas fold for 191 on day 5 to hand India a 113-run win in the first test of the series.
Teams fought very hard to try to make it up, so by no means a worrying gap between the sides. In fact, I'd say that South Africa...
We'll start here in the United Kingdom, which has hit another record high for daily COVID cases, with over 180,000 reported in the last 24 hours. But there is growing frustration over supply issues with lateral flow tests in the UK, and more people are lining up for PCR tests at various centres.
The issue that we have at the moment is that people are going into pharmacies to collect the lateral flow tests for which they have generated a code online, and therefore they are unable to access those lateral flow tests because we simply don't have them. I think the message to the public really is that generating the code does not mean that we have one there sitting ready for you. It's just generating the data nationally so that we know who's collecting them, and it's really important that people, when they do collect them, put that data online as well and let fill in that form to make sure we're aware of how many are getting negative and positive results.
The case surge has started to translate into more people ending up in hospital. Over 10,000 people were in hospital with COVID in England as of Wednesday, up 48% from last week and the highest number of admissions since March the 1st this year. The British government's now asking hospitals in England to identify sites to set up around 4,000 emergency beds to deal with a potential impending wave. But New Year's celebrations will go on, with Prime Minister Boris Johnson urging people to mark the turn of the year in a careful way.
And I'm sorry to say this, but the overwhelming majority of people who are currently ending up in intensive care in our hospitals are people who are not boosted. I've talked to doctors who say the numbers are running up to 90% of people in intensive care who are not boosted. If you're not vaccinated, you're 8 times more likely to get into hospital altogether. So it's a great thing to do. It's very, very important. Get boosted for yourself and enjoy New Year sensibly and cautiously.
Our correspondent Laura Makin-Isherwood is joining us now live from London. And Laura, The National Health Service in England is building a series of so-called Nightingale surge hubs. What will their role be?
So these are going to be set up at around 8 sites at the moment across England. So hospitals that already exist, that are already taking COVID patients. But these are sort of an extra area of capacity for each of them of around 100 beds to start with, in case they do get an influx of COVID-19 patients who might need some significant treatment for their illness. Now, of course, the NHS, sort of National Health Service bosses are saying that this is basically an insurance policy, a sort of backup to the current space that they have in their hospitals, just in case. But of course, with the sheer volume of coronavirus infections that are being recorded in the United Kingdom day on day, that means that health chiefs really want to make sure that they have that spare space to treat people should they need it.
And the English New Year festivities will largely go ahead without restrictions, won't they? But that's not the case in Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland. How's that going to work?
No, absolutely not. And the governments of Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales have all made their own decisions on bringing in restrictions ahead of New Year. They're putting in place limits on the number of people that can attend restaurants together, maybe up to 6 people. So moving back to the experience that we had here earlier on in the pandemic, at the start, before the vaccination programme was rolled out, to try to sort of slow that spread between friends and families when they're sitting together in close proximity. They're also putting limits on indoor events that are seated. Around 200 people there can sit down, and also on outdoor events as well as sporting occasions, trying to limit those mass events where multiple people are being brought together, where perhaps the virus can spread quite quickly. Here in England, though, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson says that the data currently doesn't show that new restrictions need to be put in place. Of course, he's having to balance the needs of businesses and the rest of the economy as well there, trying not to bring in any further lockdowns without it being really, really necessary, to try to sort of prevent that damage being placed on the economics of the country. He's also saying that the Omicron variant of COVID-19 doesn't look to be as severe as the Delta variant. That's after analysis that was done by South Africa and the United Kingdom. The World Health Organization, though, is saying that there is a real risk, a high risk, from the Omicron variant of COVID-19 as it becomes the most dominant variant in many countries around the world now. But in England, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson says that a booster jab is the way forward, getting vaccinated, and he's urging everyone to take up that offer.
OK, Laura, thank you. Well, top health officials do believe Omicron infections produce milder illness, but they warn the ongoing spread of Delta and the rapid proliferation of Omicron could cause what they call a tsunami of infections, which could overwhelm healthcare systems.
Right now, Delta and Omicron are twin threats that are driving up cases to record numbers, which again is leading to spikes in hospitalizations and deaths. I'm highly concerned that Omicron, being more transmissible, circulating at the same time as Delta, is leading to a tsunami of cases.
The evidence suggests vaccine protection against the Omicron variant is still positive against severe illness and death, particularly after booster jabs. And the WHO chief has once again slammed rich countries over vaccines. Dr. Tedros accuses developed nations of hogging the weapons against the virus, leaving the back door open, he says, for COVID in poorer countries.
Vaccine supply, for now at least, is improving, although the emphasis on boosters in rich countries could cause low-income countries to go short again. I call on leaders of rich countries and manufacturers to learn the lessons of Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta, and now Omicron, and work together to reach the 70% vaccination coverage.
Tedros repeated his calls for countries to share vaccines more equitably. The WHO has been campaigning for every country to hit a target of 70% vaccine coverage by the middle of next year. The global health bodies pledged to help end the acute phase of the pandemic, hoping that this phase is the end game.
We've been saying this for a very long time, the acute phase of the pandemic that's been associated with the tragedy of deaths and hospitalizations, that can end in 2022. The virus itself is very unlikely to go away completely and will probably settle down into a pattern of transmission low level, causing occasional outbreaks in under-vaccinated populations. And we hope that that is the end game here.
The surge is currently worst in Europe, according to the data that's available. Governments are being forced to walk a tightrope between imposing strict restrictions to keep healthcare systems running and the need to keep societies open after over a year of lockdowns and battering the economy. Greece this year will have a silent New Year's Eve. That's the plan anyway. In a bid to limit New Year's Eve parties, music has been banned in bars and restaurants. The fireworks show over the Acropolis has been cancelled this year. Health authorities have reported a jump in daily COVID-19 cases by more than 7,000, hitting a new all-time record. Daily COVID cases in Greece reached over 28,000 and another 72 people have died with the virus.
Στο παράγμα γιατί έχουμε πάρει ήδη εμπορεύματα για την πρωτοχρονιά, ο κόσμος έχει ήδη βγει έξω να ψωνίσει, θέλει να χαλάσει λεφτά. Δυστυχώς θα είναι άσχημα τα πράγματα, οικονομικά για τον κλάδο μας ακόμη άλλη μια φορά, γιατί υπάρχουν ήδη εμπορεύματα μέσα στο μαγαζί ώστε θα πρέπει να τα δώσουμε, άρα στην ουσία αφού δεν θα υπάρχει ο κόσμος θα τα πετάξουμε, το λογικό και το αυτονόητο.
Spain has confirmed a record 100,000 new infections in a day. Despite the surge, Spain will shorten the mandatory isolation period from 10 to 7 days for those infected. Record high cases driven by the Omicron variant are affecting top football clubs including Real Madrid and Barcelona. Spain is imposing stricter capacity limits on sporting venues. Outdoor stadiums can now use only up to 75% of their total capacity. Indoor venues can use 50% with a mandatory mask rule in place.
Hemos acordado la modificación del actual acuerdo sobre las medidas específicas frente a la COVID adoptada en relación a las competiciones deportivas de la Liga de Fútbol Profesional y también de la Liga de Baloncesto y como otros eventos deportivos. De esta forma se establece ahora hasta un máximo de un aforo en exteriores del 75% para eventos en recintos abiertos y un aforo máximo de hasta un 50% para eventos en recintos cerrados.
France has set a new national record with over 200,000 cases in a day. The number of cases jumped by 15% and has doubled now in 4 days. Some 10% of the French population has been in contact with somebody who's infected with the virus, and France is expected to touch 250,000 cases a day by the beginning of January. The government has announced some new restrictions, including mandatory face masks for everyone over the age of 11. Roughly 1,600 nightclubs up and down the country will remain closed for 3 more weeks.
Les chiffres qui seront publiés ce soir par Santé publique France montrent l'augmentation continuelle du nombre de contaminations dans notre pays. Ce sont des chiffres qui donnent le vertige. Il y a 208 000 Français qui ont été diagnostiqués positifs au Covid au cours des 24 dernières heures. J'ai fait un rapide calcul avant de vous rejoindre. Ça veut dire que 24 heures sur 24, jour et nuit, toutes les secondes dans notre pays, plus de 2 Français sont diagnostiqués positifs au coronavirus.
Belgium, meanwhile, has had to reverse one part of its strategy after a court ordered the suspension of theatres being closed. The Belgian government has allowed all cinemas and theatres to reopen after the court ruling which struck down their policy. Authorities will allow a maximum of 200 people into each venue. Face masks are obligatory and those attending will have to show proof of vaccination or a negative test. Next to Germany, where the health minister's issuing a stark warning against the current restrictions in place, calling them not enough.
Aber die Schutzmaßnahmen, die wir derzeit nutzen, die der Delta-Welle ja quasi erfolgreich begegnen, diese Maßnahmen werden nicht reichen, einen deutlichen Anstieg der Omikron-Fälle zu verhindern. Auch ich wünsche Ihnen einen guten Übergang ins neue Jahr. Sind Sie bitte vorsichtig und bis zur nächsten Gelegenheit. Vielen Dank Ihnen.
Well, that warning comes a day after Germany imposed further restrictions. Nightclubs are now shut, sporting events will be held without an audience, private gatherings are limited to 10 vaccinated people, and the unvaccinated have already been barred from shops, restaurants and cultural events. The health minister is sceptical, though, of official figures, saying the true number of cases is not being reflected since fewer tests are being done over the Christmas holiday season. It's thought the real incidence rate is 2 or 3 times as high as the official numbers. Meanwhile, several hundred people took to the streets of Munich, calling for an end to restrictions against the unvaccinated. In China's latest crackdown on Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement and independent media, Hong Kong police have charged 2 staff members from an online pro-democracy news outlet, Stand News. They've been charged with sedition. Police have charged the outlet's 2 editors, Chung Pi-Kuen and Patrick Lam. The development comes a day after Stand said it would cease all of its operations. The statement was made after hundreds of Hong Kong police raided Stand News offices on Wednesday and detained some of its staff members. Hong Kong leader Carrie Lam has denied claims of suppression of press freedom.
So these actions are law enforcement actions. These actions have nothing to do with so-called suppression of press freedom or suppression of democracy, as some will put it. So I would say that nobody should associate law enforcement actions by the police department with the freedom of the press.
US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has condemned the latest closure of a pro-democracy media outlet. He's calling on Chinese and Hong Kong authorities to cease targeting the region's free and independent media. China, meanwhile, is lashing out at the West for the criticism that it's receiving. During a media briefing, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian said that some external forces under the guise of media freedom are making irresponsible remarks about the law enforcement in Hong Kong and defaming China. Meanwhile, dozens of rights activists and various civil groups gathered in the streets of the Taiwanese capital to denounce China's aggressive actions against Hong Kong's journalists. Since the imposition of the national security law by Beijing, critics of the Chinese Communist Party have been repeatedly targeted by officials in Hong Kong. Stand News was one of the last pro-democracy media outlets in the region after the pro-democracy Apple Daily was forced to shut its doors earlier this year. Next to Australia, where the front entrance of the old Parliament House has been set on fire as protests continued outside the building. The building in the capital city of Canberra was briefly set alight by protesters during a demonstration for Aboriginal sovereignty. Chants of "Let it burn" were heard at the protest site. Workers inside the building were evacuated. No injuries were reported, but the building was forced to close last week when protesters began a similar fire at the entrance area. This latest incident follows a fortnight of demonstrations at the site.
Australian government is being served, the true sovereigns are back, and what this House is intended to be, as they see it, is an international jurisdiction where they can sit, without having to sit just in tents, with some dignity and respect.
Well, moving on to another parliament where it got heated, lawmakers in Kenya have been fighting in theirs.
Mr. Speaker, I've been attacked in this house by the master of violence in this house, Mr. Speaker. The Honorable
Order. The United Nations is in talks with Somalia's Prime Minister and President. The international community is urging them to lower tensions. An ongoing political feud between Somalian leaders has fed fears of a military clash in the country.
Somali Prime Minister Mohamed Hussein Roble spoke with a senior US official, a government spokesman said on Wednesday, amid an escalating row with the president. The senior advisor to Roble said on Twitter that the PM had spoken to Molly Fee, US Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, about the, quote, political situation in Somalia, security and elections. On Monday, President Mohamed Abdullahi Mohamed suspended Roble for suspected corruption. Roble denounced that move as a coup attempt. On Tuesday, troops loyal to the Prime Minister camped in an area near the presidential palace, raising tensions in the capital, Mogadishu. This is the latest in a long-running feud between the two men over delayed legislative and presidential elections. And the dispute is widely seen as distracting the government from fighting an insurgency by the Al-Qaeda-allied Al-Shabaab group.
And then there are countries that are not just allies, but they're also sports buddies. There's been a friendly hockey match between the political leaders of Russia and Belarus. We'll leave you with those pictures and the winner of the matchup. Thanks very much for watching.
Many other. This is right, Arab.